Maps don't just show territory, they decide what existed, and in the 1800s entire empires vanished from them, not through conquest, not through natural collapse, but through something far stranger: deliberate cartographic erasure. I'm talking about regions that appeared on official maps for centuries, labelled with the same certainty as France or China, then suddenly gone, redrawn, renamed, written out of existence while the physical territory remained exactly where it had always been. This isn't speculation. The maps still exist. You can compare them side by side, decade by decade, and watch whole civilizations disappear between editions. Tartaria is the most obvious example, but it's far from the only one. And what makes this deeply unsettling isn't just that it's happened. It's how systematically it was done, and how completely we've accepted the revised version as if nothing was ever different. Let me show you what I mean. Pull up any world atlas from 1750. There, sprawling across northern Asia, you'll find Tartaria. Not a small region, not a footnote. A massive territory stretching from the Caspian Sea to the Pacific Ocean, labelled with the same geographic authority as the Ottoman Empire, or the Russian territories surrounding it. Encyclopedias from the same period describe it in detail. Trade routes crossed it. Diplomatic records referenced it. It was simply there, part of the known world. Now look at a map from 1850. It's gone. The same geographic space now carries different labels, different borders, different political attributions. Nothing in the historical record explains this transformation. No great war erased it. No documented collapse scattered its people. It simply stopped appearing on maps, and the encyclopedias stopped mentioning it, as if collective amnesia descended across every cartographic institution simultaneously. You might think this was just outdated terminology being corrected, old names replaced with more accurate ones as geographic knowledge improved. Except that's not what the pattern shows, because Tartaria wasn't the only region that vanished this way. In North Africa, maps from the 1700s show the Empire of Morocco extending far deeper into the Sahara than modern borders suggest, controlling territories that later maps attribute entirely to French colonial acquisition. But the transition isn't documented as conquest. The borders just shift between map editions, and the historical narrative adjusts to match. South America presents an even stranger case. Pre-1800s maps frequently show vast interior regions labelled as independent territories, some with their own political designations, others marked as unexplored but clearly delineated as distinct from Spanish or Portuguese colonial claims. By the mid-1800s, these spaces have been absorbed into the colonial borders, backdated as if they had always belonged to European powers, despite earlier maps explicitly showing otherwise. What's happening here isn't correction, it's revision, and the scale suggests coordination. Think about what it takes to change a map. Cartography in the 1700s and 1800s wasn't centralised. Different institutions, different countries, different publishers all produced their own atlases. Yet somehow across Europe and America, the same territories begin disappearing from maps within the same narrow time window. The same borders get redrawn, the same names vanish. Publishers who had shown Tartaria for generations suddenly omit it, offering no explanation, no correction notice, no acknowledgement that anything changed. This is where it gets uncomfortable, because maps aren't neutral documents. They're political instruments. They establish claims. They define legitimacy. They determine who has the authority to say what exists and what doesn't. When you control the maps, you control the historical narrative. You decide what was real. And someone decided Tartaria, along with several other regions, needed to stop being real. The physical evidence contradicts the revised maps. Architecture doesn't lie. Across Central Asia, Russia, Mongolia, and even parts of Eastern Europe, you find massive stone structures that don't match the construction capabilities of the civilizations officially credited with building them. Buildings with doorways scaled for people far taller than average. Fortifications positioned to defend territories that supposedly never existed as unified political entities. infrastructure, roads, water systems, communication networks that suggest coordination across distances, the official history claims were inhabited only by scattered nomadic tribes. These structures didn't vanish when the maps were redrawn. They're still there. We just attribute them to other builders now, often with construction dates that don't align with the architectural evidence, often with explanations that require ignoring the engineering precision visible in the stonework itself. I started tracing these cartographic changes systematically, comparing atlases across decades, looking for patterns. What I found wasn't random. The erasers cluster in specific time periods, primarily between 1780 and 1860. They affect specific types of territories, usually large landmasses, in regions that later became strategically important to European colonial or imperial interests. And they're almost never accompanied by historical documentation explaining the change. It's as if the mapmakers collectively agreed to forget, and then everyone else followed. But here's what they couldn't erase. The older maps still exist. The architectural evidence remains. And if you know what to look for, the contradictions become impossible to ignore. Because once you see that empires can be written out of history simply by redrawing borders and reprinting atlases, you start wondering what else disappeared the same way. And that question leads somewhere most historians refuse to go. The architectural evidence alone should have triggered investigations decades ago. But it didn't. And when you examine why, you discover something more disturbing than the erasure itself. You discover that questioning it became professionally dangerous. Academic careers have ended over this. Not dramatically, not with public controversy, just quiet marginalization. Researchers who pursued the Tartaria question too aggressively found their funding dry up. Papers got rejected without substantive review. Tenure committees suddenly had concerns. The message was clear without ever being stated directly. Some historical inquiries are acceptable, others aren't. I've spoken with 3 different historians off the record who encountered this. All 3 described the same experience: initial curiosity about architectural anomalies in Central Asia, preliminary research suggesting construction techniques beyond the officially credited civilizations. Then, when they tried to publish or present their findings, institutional resistance. Not arguments against their evidence, just barriers, delayed reviews, closed doors, suggestions to pursue other research directions. One of them showed me correspondence from a journal editor. The rejection letter praised the research quality, acknowledged the evidence was compelling, then rejected the paper anyway because, quote, it raises questions outside the scope of current historical frameworks. Translation. Your evidence is correct, but we can't publish it because it contradicts what we've already decided is true. That's not scholarship. That's narrative maintenance. Meanwhile, the physical structures keep standing there, waiting for someone to explain them properly. Take the fortification systems scattered across what maps now show as an empty steppe. Massive stone walls, precisely engineered, positioned at intervals that suggest coordinated defensive networks spanning thousands of miles. The official explanation: built by various nomadic groups over centuries, coincidentally aligned, coincidentally using similar construction methods, coincidentally abandoned around the same time. But nomadic cultures don't build like this. They're mobile by definition. Permanent stone fortifications of this scale require settled populations, centralized planning, and resource coordination that nomadic societies explicitly don't have. Yet there they are, undeniable, unexplained, attributed to cultures whose lifestyle contradicts the very existence of what they supposedly built. The metallurgical evidence is equally problematic. Artifacts recovered from these sites show steel production techniques that shouldn't exist in that region during the attributed time periods. Not primitive smelting, advanced forging, controlled carbon content, precision that requires institutional knowledge, written records, multi-generational refinement of technique. Where's that infrastructure in the historical record? It's not there, because the civilization that developed it has been removed from that record. Then there's the written evidence, or rather its suspicious absence. For a territory that appears on maps for over a century, that encompasses millions of square miles, that would have required administrative systems and record keeping, there's almost nothing. No archives, no official documents, no diplomatic correspondence with neighbouring empires. It's as if every piece of paperwork vanished simultaneously. Libraries burned. That's the usual explanation. Records lost to time, to conquest, to natural disaster. Convenient, isn't it? The same fate befalling archives across multiple regions, all connected to territories that later disappeared from maps. All erased just thoroughly enough that we can't verify what they contained, but must accept they're simply gone. Except some documents survived. In obscure collections, in unexpected places, fragments remain. Trade records mentioning cities that no longer appear on any map. Diplomatic letters referencing governmental structures that officially never existed. Travel accounts describing infrastructure the revised history claims was never built. These fragments are dismissed as errors, misattributions, or simply ignored, because acknowledging them means acknowledging the larger patterns. I found one particularly revealing document in a private collection. A customs ledger from the 1780s recording goods crossing borders between European and Tartarian territories. Detailed entries, specific locations, tax rates, official stamps. It's not ambiguous. It's not folklore. It's bureaucratic documentation of trade with a political entity that, according to current historical consensus, wasn't organised enough to have customs enforcement. The collector who owned it didn't know what to make of it. Neither did I initially. But it sits there, physical proof that the erasure happened after the fact. That maps were redrawn to eliminate something that had definitely existed, that left paper trails even as the larger narrative was being revised. What's the alternative explanation? That cartographers across different nations simultaneously decided to invent a massive territory, place it on maps for over a century, then collectively realised their mistake and removed it. That trade records, travel accounts, and diplomatic correspondence all reference a shared delusion. That the architecture appeared spontaneously, built by no one, attributed incorrectly to cultures that couldn't have constructed it. Those aren't serious explanations. They're evasions. And the more evidence you examine, the clearer it becomes that something significant was deliberately written out of history. Not forgotten. Removed. With enough coordination that the removal itself should be the subject of historical inquiry. But it isn't. Because asking that question leads to others. Who coordinated the revision? Why did institutions across multiple countries participate? What authority decided this erasure was necessary? And most importantly, what else has been removed the same way that we simply accept as historical fact? The giants disappeared from the record around the same time. The oversized architecture got attributed to aesthetic preference. The photographic evidence got filed away as curiosities. The newspaper reports stopped, almost as if multiple threads of inconvenient history were being trimmed simultaneously, leaving only the version we're taught to accept. I started mapping the disappearances chronologically. Not just Tartaria, not just the giants. Everything that vanished from accepted history in the same narrow window. The timeline is disturbingly precise. Between roughly 1850 and 1920, we see systematic erasure across multiple categories of evidence. Maps get redrawn. Encyclopedias get revised, photographic collections get scattered, newspaper archives go missing, skeletal remains disappear into institutional storage, never to resurface. All within 70 years. That's not gradual historical revision, that's coordinated cleanup. And it coincides exactly with something else, the rapid expansion of centralized institutional control over historical narrative. Before 1850, history was documented by scattered sources, local records, private collections, regional archives, decentralized and messy, but harder to revise comprehensively. After 1850, institutions consolidated that control. National museums, centralized archives, standardized education systems. Suddenly, history flows through choke points. And at those choke points, decisions get made about what's preserved and what's discarded. I'm not suggesting conspiracy in the theatrical sense. I'm suggesting bureaucratic consolidation with narrative consequences. When one institution controls access to physical evidence, that institution decides what constitutes legitimate historical inquiry. When uncomfortable artifacts appear, they get categorized as anomalies, filed incorrectly, or simply lost during routine transfers. No dramatic cover-up required, just systematic disinterest in anything that contradicts the established framework. The architecture tells us they were here. The photographs prove they existed. The newspaper accounts document their discovery. The skeletal evidence confirms their biology. But the institutions that control historical legitimacy have decided these facts don't fit, so they're excluded, not through active suppression, but through passive dismissal. The evidence exists, but examining it seriously is considered fringe. Unserious, not worthy of academic attention. That's more effective than any cover-up. You don't need to hide evidence if you can simply make investigating it professionally unacceptable. I keep returning to those oversized chairs. They sit in museum storage, in estate sale warehouses, in architectural salvage yards. Physical objects anyone can examine. Their proportions are undeniable. Their construction is documented. Their existence is not disputed. What's disputed is their significance. We're told they're decorative, artistic, ceremonial, as if those words explain anything. Why would anyone commission a chair they physically cannot use as decoration? Why would government buildings feature decorative furniture in administrative offices where function matters? Why would such pieces appear across different continents, different cultures, different time periods, all scaled identically? Decoration doesn't explain that. Ceremony doesn't explain that. But the presence of individuals who actually fit those proportions, that explains everything instantly. The same logic applies to the doorways, the staircases, the tools, the skeletal remains, the photographs. Individually, each piece of evidence gets explained away. Collectively, they form a pattern that demolishes every individual explanation. But we're never encouraged to examine them collectively. We're taught to consider each anomaly in isolation, accept the official dismissal, and move on. That's the mechanism. Compartmentalization. Keep the evidence scattered across different disciplines, different institutions, different categories of inquiry. The archaeologists don't talk to the architectural historians. The museum curators don't consult the photographic archivists. The anthropologists dismiss the newspaper accounts without investigation. Everyone stays in their lane and the larger pattern remains invisible, except it's not invisible anymore. Digital archives have made connection possible. Photographs once scattered across private collections now appear in searchable databases. Newspaper accounts buried in microfilm get digitized and cross-referenced. Architectural surveys get compared across continents. The compartmentalization is breaking down, and the pattern is emerging despite institutional resistance. You can see it yourself. Search for photographs of unusually tall individuals from the 1800s. They're there. Examine architectural proportions in government buildings from that era. Measure them. Compare furniture from estate sales to standard human dimensions. Read the newspaper accounts from before 1920 reporting giant skeleton discoveries. The evidence isn't hidden, it's just been declared irrelevant. But irrelevance is a choice, not a fact. And that choice reveals something important about how historical narrative gets constructed and maintained. We're taught to trust institutions to tell us what matters, to accept their categorizations, their dismissals, their silence on uncomfortable topics. But institutions have interests. Maintaining established narratives is one of them. Avoiding questions that undermine foundational assumptions is another. So the giants remain footnotes. The architecture remains unexplained. The photographs remain curiosities. The skeletal evidence remains lost. And Tartaria remains a cartographic error, despite appearing on maps for over a century, despite trade records, despite diplomatic correspondence, despite physical structures that still stand. The erasure was thorough, but not complete. Fragments remain for anyone willing to look. Not hidden, just ignored. Not suppressed, just dismissed. The evidence sits in plain sight waiting for the obvious questions. Who were these people? Why did they disappear from history? What happened in that 70-year window when maps were redrawn and records vanished? And what else have we accepted as historical fact that might be equally constructed, equally incomplete, equally designed to prevent exactly these questions? The buildings remember what we've been taught to forget. The photographs preserve what the encyclopedias erased. And the pattern, once you see it, becomes impossible to unsee. Something was here, something massive, organised and deliberately written out of existence. The only question left is why we're still pretending it wasn't. History isn't what happened. It's what survived the editing process. And when you realise entire civilizations can be erased with nothing more than revised maps and institutional silence, you start questioning everything else we've been told to accept without investigation. The evidence is still there, scattered across archives and standing in plain sight. The only thing missing is permission to take it seriously. Maybe it's time we stopped asking for permission.